Welcome to Meet the Prof. Hey there, my name is Shane, and my friend Spence Hackney and I take questions from college students and ask them to Christian professors to encourage Christ-centered conversation on the college campus. And we're so glad that you joined us. Thank you for listening in here. And now you'll get to hear part 2 of my interview with Shelly Meyers. Yes, Shelly is a professor of education at Voorhees University, and it is a joy to get to introduce you to her. And before we get started, if you please click on like or subscribe or follow wherever you're listening to the podcast. And if you want to watch this and see what these professors look like, we're on YouTube. You can look us up, Meet the Prof. And so let's jump in. Here's part 2 of my interview with Shelly Meyers. All right. Well, I have a question for you about the students that you work with and the multiverse. And I don't know much except that a couple Christmases ago, my kids got me and my mom chipped in for an Oculus. So I love playing games on the Oculus.
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of funny because this whole concept was a convergence of an idea from multiple places. So one, the whole multiverse from the Marvel series and, all of that. Like my husband and my son are very into all of that. And my daughter and I kind of engage where we want to. But that whole concept is, where this kind of comes from. But I read Distracted Generation, and the author talks about, we have students who so Gen X we are the generation that were the hellions that became helicopters. And so we understand how crazy things can get, right? Well, what we've done is we've overparented in the physical world, and we have underparented in the virtual world. And most of what our students, what our kids are dealing with is actually happening in that virtual world and social media, that sort of thing. And so that concept, it really is attributed to the work that's in that book. But in church, while I was reading that, we're going over some passages, and there are all these elements of angels showing up and, prayer. And I don't know why it took this long, but somehow it became so blatantly obvious to me that we have the spiritual world that's happening at the same time. And so we have the virtual world, we have the physical world, we have the metaphysical world or the spiritual world that's happening also. And so our students are, all of us, whether we realize it or acknowledge it or not, it is happening. And so in what ways are we engaging with each of these things and in each of these universes? And how are we allocating the time to acknowledging that these things are happening? And that is so important in the way that we are working with students, particularly right now. The incoming freshman class this year is the same class of students who finished 8th grade during COVID and became freshmen in high school during COVID.
Is that right?
They are, during that developmental period of time, they lost many friends, they lost parents, they lost loved ones, but they also had a developmental disruption in that, how do I know how to make friends? Real friends? How do I engage physically, like in the physical world? How do I make eye contact? How do I engage in a conversation? Which is why I love Heather Holleman's work. I'm using a lot of her work in the work I'm doing now, because those same students are going to become teachers. And if they don't know how to engage in conversation, they're not going to stay in that field. And we need them to know how to do that. So one of the things that I really loved, we did a whole year-long study of her 6 Conversations work. And so teaching people how to ask good questions is so important in developing those warm connections with each other. And what happens in the virtual world is you have threaded conversations. So I don't have to, I get time to think about what I'm going to say in this particular thread or what emojis I'm going to use in that thread. But if I'm standing face to face with you, I got to come up with it on the fly. I got to work a little bit faster. And a lot of our students don't know how to do that. They don't know how to make friends. They don't know how to engage a stranger to ask for help for something. Like they revert to Google it. And those are very separate skills. And if we are not intentional in how we help them engage, that's on us. As the adults in the room, that is on us. And then in that spiritual sense, we also have to teach them how to pray. We have to teach them, what does it mean? What is happening in the spiritual world? How do we know, that things are happening, and to teach them those lessons and to refer to the Bible and to show them where those things are located, because it's not like it'll kind of blow your mind whenever you get into it, but being able to help them kind of navigate all of these different environments they're living, it is so much bigger than the classroom of students sitting in front of you.
I love how you are addressing two realities there. Of one, that students are living so virtually that they are ill-equipped for the material world and earth, and then also how it's like the metaphor of the virtual world shows us about the spiritual world that really is going on and is just as real as the physical world and needs to be addressed. So how interested are students in wanting to learn the interpersonal skills? Is that a felt need? What have you found?
They do not. Okay, so what they want is true friendships. They are desperate for true, engaging friendships. Not the fake kind, not the highlight reel that shows up on social media. They want someone who they can actually have a conversation with. They don't understand that there's a set of skills that comes along with that, like the active listening. They don't like starting a conversation, giving a compliment, being comfortable with silence with the friend who might be grieving or sad or whatever. Those are things that we have to explicitly teach them in a way that we may not have had to do in generations past. And so, and some of us, even as adults, we need to relearn those skills because we have forgotten them. And I think once again, God has put me in a situation to teach me this empathy, because now that I am working remotely and engaging with students online, I have so much more empathy for the shut-ins in my church, for the students who aren't coming out of their dorm rooms, who they genuinely feel like I don't have any friends. And if I do have a friend, I don't even know how to recognize that I do. And so that it's really helping me to empathize with them. And it's forcing me to make very intentional connections with people in a way that I haven't had to do before, because it's not like I can just walk out into the hallway and have a conversation with someone. I have to make an appointment or pick up the phone and call or whatever. So I have to push myself into interacting with humans and really engaging in that way. But also it's making me value those conversations so much more than I ever did before.
And you've referred to Heather Holloman a couple times, who I love, and she was our very first interview in our pilot episode. So I'll take a reference, a link to her book, The 6 Conversations. I'll put that in the description of
I want to put a little plug in there. So one of the things that I did was I took her conversations at the beginning of every class as I was doing attendance. I would ask one of the questions from her book to my students, and that's how I took attendance. So I would pose the question, and when it was their turn, they had to answer that question. And sometimes they would say, I don't know if I have an answer for that. Can you come back to me, or can I answer that later? But it really did kind of model throughout the whole time. And then I heard later that they were using those same questions, engaging in other classes. And so
the students
were using those same questions to engage in other classes.
Wow. So this was influential. For listeners who aren't familiar with Heather's book, can you give us a couple examples of the questions that you would ask?
Yeah, so I would ask, So the best question is, what is the question you wish someone would ask you? Because that tells us what you're really excited about or what you're really thinking about. And I would always answer first. I would say, so for instance, we went on a study abroad with a group to Italy, and I was so excited. And I think maybe I was talking about it uninvited way too much. And that might've been why people weren't asking me about it. But I wish people would ask me about Italy because I had so many stories that I wanted to tell. Yeah. And so that would be, my model for, I wish somebody would ask me about my trip to Italy. And so then they would be like, well, I wish somebody would ask me about how my dog is doing, or I wish somebody would ask me, how my little sister is doing, or whatever it is. And so it kind of really opened up. And then later that, I would hear them say, well, how is your little sister doing? And so it opened up the door for them to engage later outside of class. And it really bonded those students in a way that I don't think they would have bonded otherwise.
That's great. And so practical.
Yeah.
Well, there are some college students now who are not only learning to ask good questions, but they've been willing to put their questions on video and ask them to Christian professors like you. So take a listen to this question from a college student.
My name is Jamie Ward. I am a student at UNCW. I'm a senior elementary ed major graduating in December. And my question is, how has some of your biggest difficulties in life or biggest challenges pushed you closer to God? And how did you remain faithful to Him during those hard times?
Okay, so thank you so much for that question. And I'm going to answer that actually, because elementary ed is my background. And so I'm going to answer that kind of specifically. So one of the hardest things that I have ever had to deal with in my professional life is losing a student. Like a student passing away. And it made me question everything. My teaching practice, my engagement with this student, I was questioning God, trying to understand all of the circumstances around it. And that's not the student I'm thinking of is not the only student I've ever lost, but it will happen. If you are in this field long enough, it's going to happen. And so going through grief, going through something as traumatic as that, where you're not just having to care for yourself, but you're having to care for your students, care for the community, engage with, whatever media you have to engage with. There are lots of different things, engage with the grieving family, all of those things. It pushed me to a limit I didn't know I had. And it really forced me to rely on God's word and rely on prayer like it was oxygen, because I had to show up for my students and for that whole community in a way, because they couldn't handle my grief because their grief was so strong. So I had to handle my grief in a very different way. And I had to do that directly with God. And so I learned to rely on reciting scripture in my head. I had to rely on praying my way through the day. If I saw a student who was upset, praying for that student, either quietly or even stopping and praying right over that student. And it took a very, very long time for that grieving process. And sometimes I'm still a little bit haunted by that loss. But I became much closer to God in that process. I learned a lot of lessons through that process, but it also taught me how to teach my future teachers how to deal with it as well, through the way that I had to manage my own responses and those who asked me from a Christian perspective, how I handled it spiritually as well. And so those were big, hard lessons to learn. And grief is not something that the next time you encounter, you can just be like, oh, I know how to deal with that, because every grief period or season is very different. It's very different when you lose a personal loved one. It's very different whenever you lose a spouse or a friend or a pet or whatever it happens to be. And so every grief experience is different, but having that foundation built and knowing what scripture to rely on and opening your heart to the Holy Spirit, going before God with grumblings only He can understand, is a very, that's the way that I found it healthy to deal with that situation.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell me more and listeners more about what you've learned to be able to deal with the grief of others, having a classroom who's grieving the loss of a fellow classmate? Can you tell us more about what you learned in that for some faculty who may hear this and haven't lost a student yet, and they for the first time, any pitfalls to avoid or things to do?
Yeah. The biggest thing is to be comfortable in and steady in all of the emotion that is going to be in that room. Because there will be tears, there will be indifference if you have a student who is not close. There will be students who are upset. They might need to cry. They might need to leave the room. They might be angry. They're going to have, and they're going to go through a lot of those emotions at very different times. And being comfortable with listening more than you speak, and in those silent moments, praying them through, that is the biggest thing, is being comfortable with their grief. And, but grieving with them, because that is being vulnerable enough to share how you are feeling, but at the same time, understanding you are the adult in the room at that moment. Even though you are dealing with students who are entering into adulthood, they may still very much be dealing with that grief from a younger emotional state. And you never know how grief is going to hit you. Especially coming through COVID, so many of us dealt with so much grief. And if you were teaching during that period of time, you know what that felt like. And the aftermath even of it. And so one of the things that we had to deal with too, so I was a first waiver in COVID. And so I had nodules that formed in my lungs. And so I had to have part of my lung removed and several lymph nodes. They thought it was cancer. They thought it was tuberculosis. Really? They didn't know what it was. My students were praying me through that. And I received so many texts and emails, and a student showed up at the door with a basket of gifts to help me heal. Like, it was just, you can't underestimate the community that you have the opportunity to build, and sharing in vulnerability and understanding that this academic experience they're going through is not just academic. It is a growing experience in multiple ways. And grief can be something that either breaks you apart or bonds you. And choosing to let it bond you and being vulnerable enough to share in that experience and being that soft place for them to land is so very important. So, and also reaching out to someone who might be able to be, if you are experiencing all of that trauma from your students, you have to have a way to in a healthy way, unload that so that you are not experiencing secondary trauma. So that is a very important thing. So going to counseling, talking to your pastor, talking to, someone who you trust is so very important so that you are not dealing with that in an unhealthy way.
Seems like such good advice. Thanks for sharing that. And I'm sorry for the loss of that student and others, it sounds like. And even at our own university and somewhere my kids have attended, we've had that horrible loss. But I feel so grateful that there are faculty like you in these students' lives. And thanks for your willingness to really go there and in their grieving and to be able to grieve with them and help them with theirs.
Thank you.
One of the privileges we have in this podcast is getting your advice for so many different angles. And so we call this a lightning round, where we want to ask you for advice on all kinds of different scenarios. So the first one, Shelly, is what is your advice to an 18-year-old? What's the advice you would give to your own 18-year-old self?
My 18-year-old self, I would say, don't try to impress anyone. Believe who God says you are. Believe who God says you are.
Okay. All right. What about your advice for parents who are sending off their kid to college?
Yeah, I'm in this right now. And I don't like this side of the seat because I have a freshman daughter. And so I would say with my professor hat on, and I'm trying very hard to practice this as a parent, is pray your child, your student through the struggle. Don't rescue them. They have lessons that God needs them to learn. So pray them through. Listen to them, but don't rescue them. Let them learn the lesson in the way that God intends them to learn it.
What are some ways that parents would be tempted to rescue their kid and they shouldn't?
Okay, so I was just dealing with this yesterday. So if they have a class that is not going well and they are ready to throw in the towel, do not call the school and change their schedule for them.
Oh, no.
Do not call the professor. Do not email the professor. Make them go handle it themselves. Make them go have the conversation. Reach out to a success coach. Reach out to their advisor. Reach out to the professor themselves and figure out don't rescue them. That will not go well.
Okay, thank you. Well, Shelly, what advice would you give to other Christian professors who want to have an influence on their campus for Christ, and especially if they are not at a Christian school?
Yeah, so this one is really interesting because different campuses have different policies on what you can and cannot say, and what you and there are also kind of social written and unwritten rules about this. And if you're in the promotion or tenure process and you know who's on the promotion tenure committee, like there are lots of things that come on there. However, in your introduction, there are ways that you can present yourself. You can say what church you happen to go to or whatever, if you are comfortable doing that. One of the ways that I do that is I put my Meet the Prof on the introduction in my Canvas course. And so I always say, if you want to know more about me personally and my spiritual walk, you are welcome to view that. And if you want to talk about it, let me know. And then some of them will come back and say, can we talk more about that? Or some of them will be like, I read your profile. I didn't. Yeah. And so it really kind of opens a door. And then also, if you have crew on your campus, plug into crew and faculty commons, because there will be others who can help advise you in appropriate ways to do that on your campus. But there is a session that's done every once in a while called What I Can't Say in the Classroom. And that is where you can tell your spiritual story in a safer environment, because it's not in a classroom setting, and students are not required to attend. They can choose to. You don't give them extra credit for attending, nothing like that. It's just open. Whoever wants to come is welcome to come. And then that kind of opens some doors as well.
That's great. Thank you. So this branches out from advice questions, but what is your favorite Bible verse?
Okay, so I go through seasons of favorite Bible verses, but I went back to my journal because I wanted to find one that was like current for what I'm experiencing now. So I just changed jobs from a job I had for 19 years. I was a full professor, tenured, and I walked away to do something that God had planned for me in a place I had no intention of going, but he was like, and here you go. And so that is, he's teaching me about seasons, and this is definitely a new season. And I love it. I'm so thankful. I'm so grateful for being in this season. But this verse, Isaiah 43:18-19, he says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. And that spoke so strongly to me, because there was so much to celebrate, so much that I felt proud about accomplishing and finish. I wanted to finish well in what I had been asked to do. And closing out all of those projects and moving into this new season and getting to work with the amazing people that I get to work with at Voorhees University and EPI Center and all of the things that I'm doing. God is opening up a new world and a new mission field that I was resistant to, but his timing was perfect in it. And so this new thing that he is doing is just an amazing blessing.
That ministers to me. So the last question on the lightning round I want to ask you is, what is something you think that people would be most surprised to know about the life of a professor, whether students being surprised to know it or parents?
So students probably don't realize how much we think about them. We carry them home with us. I think they would be surprised to know how much that actually happens. Parents, same thing. We care about your kids. But I think something a lot of people don't know is that professors don't make very much money. Most of us don't, especially early career professors. Public school teachers sometimes, most of the time, make more money than professors do.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so I think that a lot of, depending on what kind of school you're at, depending on what your field is, depending on your negotiation skills, those are things that I think a lot of people would be surprised to know.
Well, Shelly, this has been a joy. I just feel like we don't have enough time in this, but thank you so much for sharing about your life, your early spiritual journey, and thanks for sharing your love for the students. And I'm personally just really inspired by this step of faith now you've taken to move after 19 years to go to Voorhees University now. And I'm excited for this chapter for you. So thank you for sharing all this. And if students want to reach out to you more, is there a way that they can follow you or reach out to you?
Sure. So my information is on meettheprof.com. And then my email address is there as well. My personal email address is Shelly Meyers, edd@gmail.com. So they can reach me there. And LinkedIn would probably be the best place. Family and friends are mostly on, Facebook or whatever. But if they want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, that would be a place to reach out.
That's great. And I'll put all those links in the description for your episode here. So great. Well, Shelly, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Shane.
Well, I am so thankful for Shelly. I'm so glad you got to hear that interview with her. And feel free to reach out to her. We're putting her email address in the description of the podcast. And I know she would welcome that, any of your comments or questions. So thank you for tuning in. And if you are a college student, remember you can follow us on Instagram. That's Meet the Prof Official. We hope that this encourages you to have a Christ-centered conversation on your college campus.